All right, so this is a basic video showing how to do vinyl gluing for the process of building some of the inflatables that we make. So to start from the very basics, the material is PVC or vinyl, and comes in a lot of different shininess, color, some stuff's clear, it can be printed on. And as far as putting it together, there's several different ways that you can attach the different pieces together. You can sew it. It's not really that great because it can tear. There are some ways that you can do some like overlap type stitches that work pretty well. But for what we're doing, since we're trying to keep it airtight, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. The other few ways that you can put them together are RF welding or heat welding or ultrasonic welding. All of those things basically result in melting the material together. One problem though with that method is that the machine kind of smooshes the two pieces together and it kind of creates a thin seam. So you basically end up having to use a much thicker material in order to get the seam strength. And what we've discovered in our method, we use a method of chemical welding or glue, if you want to kind of look at it that way. It actually, chemical welding is a more appropriate term because it actually melts the material together chemically, but you put it on like a glue. It works better because it is thicker and we actually build up material as we're making a seam. So anyhow, to get on about the gluing technique, we use this vinyl cement. We actually get it in this huge jug, HH66. We decant it into a smaller container that's easier to deal with. And originally we'd use Q-tips, but that was actually kind of messy. And we later discovered using these syringes really makes it a lot easier to deal with. And there's several different needles that you can use depending on what you're doing. If you're doing really big areas, this big needle is nice. It's also kind of long so you can spread with, but I have found really the all-purpose is this green one. It's a pretty good gauge. There's also some thin ones, which are great for going back later. If you have like a leak in between a seam, you can get that little thin one in there. But basically, don't look at this stuff as glue because it doesn't really work like glue where you, let's see, I'll get a different piece of material here. It doesn't really work like glue in that you can fill in a void with it. It's better to look at it like you put this stuff down, and actually that needle is clogged. I'll swap that out, the new one. So once you put this down, I always like to pull the plunger back so it doesn't keep running. You want to put a lot of pressure because that is what is going to get a good bond. I generally like to use something to roll with. You can use like a little glass jar. And your work time is about a minute or so. So like right now, I could peel this back apart if I wanted to. Like if I said, oh man, that's not good. And if you immediately put it back together, it'll actually kind of rebond. See, it's still got a lot of adhesion, but generally if I tear it apart, I'll kind of usually put more back on it. This stuff is not really like contact cement where you put the glue down, you let it dry, then you stick it together. You really want to put this stuff together wet because it's going to dissolve the material you're putting it on and melt it together. And so that's why the pressure is so critical. You don't want to have any wrinkles because that's going to be your enemy with trying to make it airtight, of course. Temperature is kind of critical. You want to do this at room temperature. You don't want to do it real hot, like in front of a heater. You might not get a good bond, and you also don't want to do it like in the freezing cold. So if you're working out in a garage, you definitely want to make sure your temperature is maintained pretty close to room temperature is best. And again, it forms a better seam because you're adding material to it. The glue actually has dissolved vinyl in it, so you're adding to it. And so you can actually get much stronger seams using this technique. And so that's the next thing to talk about is what types of seams do you want to do? Well, there's a couple different ways that you can do a seam. You can do a together seam, which is done, that's kind of your more common one in sewing, where you bring two pieces together, two pieces together, and then you would sew along there. Well, if that were glued, you would do the same thing and glue between it. That's actually one of the worst seams because, and I've got one here that I did yesterday. What happens, so I did this one, you put your glue, and once it dries, you push it down. Well, it's never going to be a straight line. It is here, but where the glue flows, it's going to be wavy, and you can kind of see that here. Definitely, you can see it when I pull it apart here. You can see there's peaks and valleys. The problem is so if you made an inflatable like this, and all of a sudden you start to inflate it, you can see what's going to happen, and eventually you're gonna probably form a hole at one of those peaks. So that's why that doesn't really work very well. Now, the best seam to do is an overlap. That's this guy. And that's, of course, where you take two pieces and you do at least about a half an inch or so, 3/8, and you just kind of glue and overlap. So this is much stronger because as it inflates, you're not going to have any problems. It's actually, you're going to probably tear the material on some other point rather than on the seam, because the seam is thicker. The seam is actually stronger than the material itself now. So the together seam is, the overlap seam is really the best one to do. But you do get into some situations where you have a piece of material, and then maybe you put a zipper right here, and then you need to attach another layer here next to the zipper. Well, that's where you can kind of do this orthogonal seam. So you're kind of look at it like you've got this flat piece, and then you're wanting to bring in another piece kind of to it, and maybe your zipper's right here. And so this right here is forming another air chamber back over here. So this one, as you can see, it's super strong. And the way that we get that strength is we take a piece of material. Let's see, I can use, and we bring it down and we do a bit of an overlap, or actually really, it kind of starts off almost as a together seam. So you'd put some glue, and then you would bond it, but then you'd flip it back, and then you would put a little piece of trim over that side, maybe about a half an inch. And then what that ends up doing, we'll go back to the piece I have finished here. That basically gives you this nice, and there you can see right here, this is my strip that I've put over. So this piece came down, folded back, and glued on that side. And then on the other side, I've got this strip here. And so that basically puts a nice overlap seam on both sides of that joint. So it's extremely strong. So we do that a lot on the shirts, the pants, around zippers. That happens quite frequently. Shirts and pants happens because you have the elastic, say like the waistband is here, and then you want to bring your second layer to stop just short of the elastic waistband, so that you would use this kind of a seam. So those are the three types of seams. tricks for making the seams, I wanted to kind of go over real quick. So one thing that I do is I use a jar, because just about everything that you do is three-dimensional and it's curved. There's a lot of curved seams. And if you were doing flat objects, then you could make a flat seam on a flat surface like this. But just about everything we're doing is clothing related, so all of the seams have a bit of a curve to them. And to compensate for that, it's really easy if you work across a curved surface. So, for example, if I wanted to take and put a piece of material like this, and say I want to make this kind of a orthogonal seam, what I could do is I could kind of fold it under and stretch it across the jar. And now all I have to do is just take my my glue, and I can just kind of do a bead like this and run it under there. And then I can take my roller, and you can actually do long stretches, at least the where you can wrap most of the way around the jar, and you can glue that whole thing at once because it's going to hold it taut. And then you can glue it, and then you can take it up, and then you can move to the next piece and glue it. And then when you get done, you'd come back, and that's where you would glue your little strip across that. You'd cut a strip that's at least probably about a half an inch wide. And actually what I could do is I could kind of demonstrate that here with some of this tape. By the way, I'm wearing nitrile gloves. They're one of the only gloves that work with this glue. Latex ones will fall apart. And of course, vinyl gloves will bond with the glue. You don't want that. So nitrile works real well. The glue just kind of flakes off. So pretend that's a strip of vinyl. You've folded it under and glued it. Now you would take and put your vinyl down, and actually, let's pretend that we've glued this bit. We put some glue on the end, and we've anchored it down. And then basically you can sit here and work with it like this. You can add glue like this. And I kind of just spread it around, and depends on how fast you can get with this. I can do probably about 4 or 5 inches at a time. You might want to start with just an inch or two, and then you'll lay that down and roll it. I'm not going to do that because I want to use this later. But you'd lay that down, and then you would roll it and kind of work with it for about 30 seconds before you move on, because it might peel back up. But it's good to kind of put pressure and kind of work with your seam for about 30 seconds, and then you can kind of move to the next spot. So that's one trick, is to use the jar or the roller. Painter's tape really helps a lot. Let me show you a little trick real quick. For example, you want to make a tunnel. So we're going to take a strip of material, we're going to roll it around this jar, we're going to make a tunnel that's that wide. Well, what we can do to make this really clean is we can take some painter's tape. Yes, it's a little more to get it set up, but it's a whole lot easier. It looks a lot nicer once you get it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and I am going to put a piece of tape across. So that's going to kind of hold that piece there. And then take another piece, and I'm basically looking at where they're going to overlap. This is maybe a little bit more of an overlap than I really want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, cut it a little bit. Scissors work pretty well for cutting. If you have access to one of these roller and cutting mats, they work great for cutting the material as well. So a couple different ways you can do it. All right, so now I've got that taped down, and that part that's exposed is going to end up being my seam. So then I can take my other piece of tape, and I kind of looked at how much is going to be of an overlap. I'm going to do this on this side, and that's going to mask it off. It's going to keep the glue from getting on areas that I don't want it. So now I have that, and what I can do is just and if you get glue on your hands or gloves, I recommend you wearing gloves because this stuff has acetone and toluene and it's not good to get on your skin. You can just rub it together and it will basically solidify instantly. And then if you rub it a few more times, it just kind of flakes off in little white threads. So if you get a lot of glue, like I did, I put maybe a little bit more than I needed to, it'll wrinkle like that, but it'll eventually go back flat after a couple of minutes. And it's basically, that's kind of what happens when it dissolves the material. So it's a good idea if it wrinkles like that to kind of keep an eye on it and maybe periodically kind of put some pressure on it, but just give it a few minutes and it'll flatten back out. But basically that keeps the tape, kind of keeps that seam real nice and clean. I don't have any excess glue there. And when I take this off, then I can, of course, flip it inside out and pull the other piece of tape back off. And then I end up with a real nice overlap there on a tunnel. So that's a nice trick for getting a real nice seam. You can even do that without a jar if you just were working on something and you wanted to connect it over. You could kind of do the same thing with the tape, just kind of tape it off. You could even do a third piece from what I did. Since I don't have a jar, I could kind of do a piece like this, and then I could work over that, and that way if glue goes down, it doesn't go to the other side and get on that piece, and then you'd still have your piece here and then your piece underneath. So painter's tape is really awesome, especially if you're doing work near print. So you got to be real careful. Vinyl, if it's got graphics on it, this stuff is printed on. If you get glue on this, then it really can be a problem because that print will wipe right off. So that'll happen if glue gets on it. It will also happen if you get acetone on it, which, let me get a little bit of acetone here. Just gonna put a little bit. All right, put a little bit there. It's good to work with this in a ventilated area. I'm not going to keep it inside here for very long. It gives off a lot of fumes, which are highly combustible. Don't do it near a heater, and it's also not good to breathe for a long period of time. So it's good to do it outside or where you got a fan blowing out a window. But same thing there. Acetone will wipe that print right off. So you really want to be careful if you're doing like a zipper on a whale and it's near print. You really want to take a bunch of this blue painter's tape and cover that area so that you don't accidentally get glue or acetone on it. For cleanup, if you can get glue, and actually I was careless and I didn't pull my plunger back in and it put a little spot of glue right there. If you can take and get that up quick, it's a lot easier now than it will be later. So you can see I wiped it off and you can see how it started to dissolve the material there. I can take a little bit of acetone and it comes off so much easier if you catch it and clean it immediately rather than wait a day. If you wait a day, then it's a little harder to get off. You'll notice it makes it curl a little bit. Just let it air out. After it evaporates, it'll kind of flatten back out. There is a piece here that I have some spots of glue on. Now, I don't know how well you can see this. Can you see these spots there of glue? It might have to just be the right light. So you can clean this up. The best way to do it is with a Q-tip and some acetone. And you don't really want to use, you can see what happened there. You don't want to keep using the same tip because you'll just smear the glue. If you just kind of do once and then go to another Q-tip and then do it again, I'm doing a different spot. I kind of have a few different spots. The least that you use that tip, the better it will look. It'll take off less of the shine if it's a shiny material. If it's a clear material, it won't make it look foggy. If you use just one tip and then use another tip and then you're going to go through Q-tips a lot, but it'll look better. But that'll get glue off. And like I said, if you do it while it hasn't completely dried, it'll come off a lot quicker, a lot easier. The other thing that we do use sometimes is toluene, which it's a little bit more of a mild cleaner for getting glue off of vinyl. It takes a little more work. It's a little more oily. But if you're working with like a shiny material and you really want to be careful and make sure it looks good, toluene actually works better. It's a little worse to breathe, so you really want to do that outside more so than acetone. But toluene definitely has its advantages sometimes if you're cleaning a delicate area and you want to make sure it looks good. So now the other thing I'll mention though is after you clean this with acetone, if it rolls over and if it touches itself, let's just kind of speed this process up. If it lays there for a while where I'd cleaned it, you're going to have a problem. It's already bonding, and that's just from the acetone. The acetone breaks down the material, and if it touches itself, it's going to try to bond. And it can get a strong enough bond where when you try to pull it apart, you'll rip a hole. So to fix that problem, what you want to do is use a powder like talcum powder, but I don't recommend talcum powder because it's got asbestos in it. It's bad to breathe. The alternative to talcum powder is cornstarch. So it doesn't take much. I'm going to actually just kind of touch the lid there, get it on my finger, and put a little bit where I worked with the acetone. And you can do it immediately after, even before it's dry. And now it's not going to stick to itself. So if you do work with acetone, immediately cover it with cornstarch. And that's kind of the basics. We'll do a little bit more of the advanced stuff in some of the other videos. So at least this is kind of a basics to get started and to start gluing seams.
Thank you.
Thank you.